Glad to know you're still with me. Amid the recent loss of its majority in the election, South Africa's National Treasury is committed to maintaining a balanced fiscal stance under a potential coalition government. The African National Congress, ANC, now faces the task of forming a coalition or power-sharing arrangement with other political parties within a limited time frame. Despite the possibility of policy concessions during coalition negotiations, the Treasury aims to uphold its fiscal strategy, emphasizing its achievability even in a coalition environment. This commitment comes as South Africa's economy recorded a small contraction in the first quarter of 2024, with gross domestic product (GDP) shrinking by 0.1% in quarter-on-quarter seasonally adjusted terms. These developments underscore the significance of the Treasury's fiscal stance in navigating the country's economic challenges. Phelisa Nkomo, economist from South Africa, joins me for more on this. Thank you, Phelisa, for joining me today.
Hi, good afternoon, and good afternoon to the listeners.
Okay, I think I just want to begin by just, hearing you talk to us about what's happening over there right now, what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, there are discussions. I think the ANC, since it managed to secure just about 40% in terms of the elections, so it's in consultation with several parties because it's unable to form a government because it hasn't met the 51% threshold during the elections that were held last week. So yesterday it issued a statement that it's in conversation with several political parties. And obviously one can assume that within that conversation is about what policy concessions and what's the middle ground that each political party or both political parties could actually find during the negotiations. We are still yet to hear what other political parties are saying in terms of their own demands to the ANC. Just for your information, that constitutionally, so after the elections have been declared, the ANC has about 14 days for it to actually either form a government or we go back into the elections. So I think the ANC, with its 40%, I think it's probably pushing for the formation of a government before the 14 days. And we're hoping that in between these negotiations, we'll get to hear what is actually being announced. I mean, one of the key things, though, I think it's an opportunity for all political parties, and particularly even for the ANC, because in this context it got voted most, is to make it sure that it's quite transparent about some of the proposals, but as well as the concessions, because I don't think that South Africans should be caught off guard with regards to some of the transparency. So there's an opportunity to actually make it sure that there is consultation that is taking place, but also citizens are a lot more informed about what is being put on the table on their behalf.
Okay, I want specifics now. So tell me, what specific policy concessions do you sort of see the ANC making in coalition negotiations, and how do you think these concessions could sort of affect the Treasury's balanced macro-fiscal stance?
By the way, to be honest with you, I actually don't think that there's going to be any concessions. I'll tell you for what reason. If you look at the manifestos of political parties that have actually secured the 2 seats, 10 seats, 60 seats, they're not really far apart from each other. So you're not likely to really experience major policy issues. I mean, I know, for instance, if you talk about issues around with one of the political parties, which was quite open on the issue around closing the borders, for instance. In fact, I mean, what you've actually said on the screen now, political parties are quite aligned. Where you're likely to have new issues emerging is the approaches of combating crime, is the approaching of dealing with safety and security, is the approach around combating corruption, is the approaches around labor market reforms, where in fact political parties that are actually subscribed to neoliberal policies will then demand for much flexible labor policies that should be introduced in the market, and meaning that you minimize the influence and the power of trade unions and workers within labor movement. That's one of the issues. I think even with the fiscal balance approach, by the way, depending on which political party, I know very well that both MK political party, Mkhonto weSizwe political party, EFF would not support, for instance, austerity measures. But I know Democratic Alliance is likely to be, because it's likely to support introduction of austerity macroeconomic policies, even though I think most of the political parties are really starting to feel the pressure of austerity macroeconomic policy, both from an interest rates perspective, but as well as the contraction in terms of fiscal policy spending. So I do think that, and I think with one of the points that you've made, that I mean, we've just grown at about 0.1% against a projection of 0.6% of GDP. So the implications are quite clear that you're likely to have a lot more consensus. But I think for me, the point I was making earlier, that I do think that between what the ANC has proposed as its manifesto in terms of job creation, industrial development, activating supply side and labor side of the economy, does require that there be a public consultation before it locks itself into a coalition agreement with other political parties.
All right, just like you said, I mean, the party has 40 days, and I hope that in the coming days we'll have this conversation again after the party might have made its choice. Now, away from that, I mean, you talked about GDP earlier, right? I want us to talk about it more emphatically now. Now, with the recent economic contraction and ongoing challenges, how realistic do you think the central bank's GDP growth forecast of 1.2% for 2024 would be? I mean, considering the uncertainty surrounding coalition negotiations.
Let me tell you, I mean, it's common in any other country, by the way, when it faces elections. And I think what made it extremely unique about South Africa is that we have more political parties that registered than before. I mean, on average, we used to have about, 10, 12 parties. Now, for instance, we actually have 6 new political parties that are actually in parliament, which is a little bit surprising. I mean, 30 years into a democratic dispensation. But also the other side, it shouldn't be surprising, because you've seen an increased discontent among South Africans who are looking for, who've openly actually demanded for a new perspective and new approaches to stimulate the economy. So I do think that whoever that gets into coalition with the government needs to really think through around the specific interventions around stimulating the economy. So that 3 critical issues that government needs to really make it sure that it undertakes. I think the first one is to, and we often call it, most of heterodox economics, is that convert South Africa into a construction site, meaning that actually delay the austerity measures, introduce very clear public spending, right? And in fact, this is something quite interesting, which I don't know if you actually picked up in the elections, was that there was a declaration of what would call technical budget surplus. Now, you can't be experiencing a 0.1 growth and then you actually have a surplus. Because I think if I put it in simple terms, if you don't spend money in your family is going to get hungry. That's it. And that's what we're experiencing in South Africa, that the construction is consistent with austerity measures. Because remember, when a private sector is actually keeping or you are experiencing what is called investment strike, the role of the state is to show a massive, or it needs to multiply spending in the economy, but show a much more deeper risk appetite instead of taking on a risk averse. So the 0.1% is not primarily surprising. In fact, if you read as well the monetary policy statement, I think, of February, one of the concerns they're raising is that they're still concerned that they have not seen increased spending in terms of capital formation, which in fact is one of the key drivers of economic growth in any country. So in essence, I think everyone else is really watching. It's really difficult to predict on whether are we going to be really meeting the 0.6 threshold, because I think everything else is actually going to be influenced by the collision conversation outcomes. And of course, given the growth trajectory of South Africa and development paradigm of South Africa, 0.6% is absolutely not sufficient. In fact, we need above 3% for us to really make a breakthrough. And hence the call for investors to actually coming through, but they won't come through unless the state spend, because in fact, state spending has what we call a crowding in investment potential. And so if the state is still showing a risk-averse attitude in its spending, you're not likely to actually attract a lot of investment in the economy.
All right, thank you so much. Just before you go in 30 seconds, what other structural reforms do you think are necessary to address rolling power cuts, unemployment, infrastructure, and all of those? In less than 30 seconds.
Fundamentally, you shift your resources from social policy, you deploy them in industrial development. Currently, South Africa spends 59.2% on social security and as well as 10% on industrial development. That misnomer is actually quite problematic for South Africa. I think the second thing is that activate public spending through your capital formations. I mean, our GDP spending on capital formation has been less than 10%. And if you turn this country into a construction site, you build railway infrastructure, you create jobs for young people, but also you target labor-intensive sectors of the economy to attract both young people and as well as women. You use public procurement as a lever to transform the economy. And fundamentally, then you invest in domestic industrialization and provides incentives for people who are willing to buy and use domestic technology
All right.
for production or manufacturing.
Okay, thank you so much, Phelisa Nkomo, economist, for your time.